The Alpha King had not opened his eyes in 3 years. Yet every night, when the castle bells fell silent and the servants abandoned the northern wing, the unconscious king only stopped trembling after she touched him. The first time the young Omega noticed it, warm water had slipped from the cloth in her hands and rolled across his scarred chest. His breathing changed instantly, slower, deeper. The candles beside the bed stopped flickering so violently. She froze beside the tub, water dripping from her fingers onto the black marble floor, while the storm outside clawed against the tower windows. Behind her, one of the older maids let out a nervous laugh. "Look at that," the woman whispered. "The dead wolf likes being pampered." Quiet snickers followed. None of them stepped closer. None of them ever did. The room smelled like cedar oil, cold stone, and old silver medicine bowls that had been sitting untouched for years. Massive curtains hung around the king's bed like funeral drapes. Even unconscious, he looked terrifying. Broad shoulders, pale skin marked by fading claw scars, long silver-black hair spilling across white sheets no one else dared change anymore. They said the Alpha King had collapsed during the Blood Moon War after shielding his entire pack from a curse meant to wipe out the royal line. They also said his soul never truly came back. Most people in the castle already treated him like a beautiful corpse waiting for burial. But she still bathed him every night, carefully, respectfully, as if he could still feel the warmth of the cloth sliding over his skin. "Faster," another maid muttered near the doorway. "The regent wants the hall prepared before midnight." The girl nodded softly and reached for fresh water. Her sleeves were damp to the elbows now. A faint bruise darkened one wrist where a servant had grabbed her earlier downstairs for walking too slowly with the medicine trays. She never complained. The northern tower belonged to silence anyway. Complaints sounded wrong here. Outside the chamber doors, castle servants moved quickly through the halls, carrying black banners stitched with the royal crest. Not gold anymore, black, mourning colors. The kingdom was preparing for transition. People no longer whispered if the regent would take the throne. They whispered when. A cold draft slipped beneath the doors. One candle went out. The girl glanced toward the bed again. The Alpha King remained motionless beneath layers of dark blankets trimmed in silver thread. But something about the room felt strange tonight. Too still, too heavy. Even the older maids had stopped talking. One crossed herself under her breath. Another stared toward the windows as if expecting something to appear beyond the storm. Then came the sound. Soft, barely there, a low vibration deep in his chest. The youngest maid gasped and backed into a table hard enough to rattle the medicine bottles. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Nobody answered immediately. The Omega girl slowly dipped the cloth back into warm water and wrung it gently between trembling fingers. Steam curled upward around her face. She stepped closer to the bed again. "It was probably the thunder," one maid said too quickly, but her voice cracked halfway through. The girl reached for the king's hand to clean the dried medicine stains from his fingers. Large hands, cold hands, hands that had once commanded armies. Her thumb brushed across his knuckles. The room suddenly went silent. No thunder, no rattling windows. Even the fire seemed to lower itself. Then it happened. One finger moved. Small, sharp, real. The cloth slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a wet sound. Across the room, somebody inhaled so hard it almost became a scream. By sunrise, the entire northern wing smelled like smoke and fear. Nobody said the king's finger had moved. Not openly, but servants who had never climbed the tower before suddenly avoided the stairwell completely, crossing themselves whenever they passed the black iron doors below. Rumors traveled faster than horses inside the castle, especially frightened ones. The Omega girl carried fresh linens through the eastern corridor with her eyes lowered, but whispers followed her anyway. "She's lying. No coma victim just wakes up after 3 years. The regent said the body reacts sometimes." Bodies don't growl. That last voice dropped into silence immediately. A silver tray clattered somewhere farther down the hall. No one laughed afterward. Outside, workers draped black mourning cloth over the massive wolf statues lining the palace courtyard. Preparations for the succession ceremony had already begun before dawn. Long tables filled the grand hall. Noble families arrived by carriage beneath gray skies, their banners snapping sharply in the cold wind. The kingdom was moving on. Or trying to. The girl kept walking. Warm towels balanced carefully in her arms. Steam curled against her chin as she climbed the final staircase toward the northern chamber. Halfway there, footsteps approached from above. Heavy, measured. Soldiers. She immediately stepped aside against the wall. 4 royal guards descended first in dark armor marked with silver claw crests. Then came the regent himself. Tall, broad-shouldered, his dark coat swept across the stone steps behind him like spilled ink. The conversations around him always died too quickly. Even now, the servants nearby lowered their heads before he reached them. The Omega girl did the same. Silence stretched. 1 second too long. The regent stopped directly in front of her. She could feel it before seeing it. The stillness. The pressure. Slowly, she lifted her eyes just enough to meet the silver wolf ring on his gloved hand. "You were inside the chamber last night," he said calmly. She nodded once. "And?" Her fingers tightened around the towels. Tiny droplets of water slid onto the floor. "His hand moved, my lord." A servant behind her inhaled sharply. Another immediately looked away. The regent remained expressionless, but one of the guards shifted his stance uneasily. Just slightly. "You are young," the regent replied. "Exhaustion creates fantasies." He stepped around her, then paused. His gaze flicked toward the towels in her arms. "Still," he added after a moment, "continue your duties." The hesitation barely lasted a heartbeat, but she noticed it. So did the older guard standing nearest the stairs. The man's eyes narrowed faintly before he followed the regent downward. Inside the chamber, the air felt colder than usual. The fire had burned low overnight. Thin winter light spilled across the king's bed in pale strips. She approached quietly, setting the basin beside him. For a moment, everything looked unchanged. The same still figure beneath dark blankets, the same silver-black hair spread across the pillow, the same impossible silence. Then she noticed the water glass near the bed. Yesterday, it had been untouched beside the candle tray. Now it rested closer to the edge of the table, barely an inch, but enough. Her breathing slowed. One of the older maids entered behind her carrying fresh medicine jars. "Don't start again," the woman muttered quickly when she saw the girl staring. "People are already nervous enough." She moved toward the shelves, but her hands shook while arranging the bottles. One slipped. Glass shattered across the floor. Both women flinched. The king's chest rose suddenly with a rough inhale. The maid stumbled backward so fast she nearly hit the wall. Silence crashed into the room again. The girl stepped toward the bed instinctively. "Your Majesty?" she whispered before catching herself. No answer came, only the storm outside tapping softly against the tower windows. The older maid pressed a hand against her own chest. "I'm requesting reassignment," she said immediately, voice trembling. "I'm done with this room." She rushed for the door without waiting for permission. The Omega girl remained beside the bed alone. The basin water rippled once, very gently, then stopped. Her eyes lowered toward the king's hand resting near the blanket edge. One finger had moved closer to hers. The castle stopped sleeping after the 3rd night. Doors opened faster now whenever footsteps echoed through the northern halls. Servants whispered before speaking out loud, glancing over their shoulders first, as if the walls themselves had started listening. Even the guards posted outside the tower chamber no longer stood comfortably. One kept rubbing the silver wolf charm around his neck every few minutes. Another jumped when a distant tray crashed somewhere below. The Omega girl noticed all of it while carrying fresh cedar water through the corridor before dawn. Nobody mocked her anymore. That frightened her more. The massive chamber doors groaned open. Warm steam drifted upward from the basin in her hands as she stepped inside. The room was darker than usual. Thick storm clouds buried the morning light behind the windows, leaving only candles burning beside the bed. Their flames leaned strangely toward the king instead of upward. She slowed near the mattress. Something had changed again. The blankets covering his chest had shifted lower during the night. Not much, just enough to expose the old claw mark near his collarbone. Yesterday it had still looked pale and dead around the edges. Now the skin there carried faint color again, human color, living color. Her breath caught softly. Behind her, one of the younger servants entered carrying folded towels. The girl took 2 steps inside before freezing completely. "No," she whispered immediately. No, I don't want this shift anymore." The towel slipped from her arms onto the floor. She backed away so quickly she nearly stumbled over the doorway. The Omega girl turned. "What happened?" His eyes were open. The servant's voice cracked apart. "Last night, just for a second." Silence swallowed the room. The younger servant pressed herself against the wall like she expected something to lunge from the shadows. "I swear I saw them," she whispered. "Gold, looking right at me." Before the Omega girl could answer, a horn suddenly echoed through the castle below. Loud, sharp. The succession council had arrived early. Immediately, the hall outside erupted with movement. Boots striking stone, servants rushing downstairs, distant noble voices carrying upward beneath the sound of rain hammering the windows. The interruption broke the tension for only a moment. Then the bed creaked softly. Both girls snapped their heads toward it. The Alpha King's hand had shifted farther across the blanket. This time, there was no doubt. His fingers were curled slightly inward now, like someone slowly waking from deep sleep. The younger servant let out a frightened sound and rushed from the room without another word. Her footsteps disappeared down the hallway at full speed. The Omega girl remained frozen beside the basin. Water trembled gently inside it. The king's breathing changed again. Longer pauses, then deeper inhales that seemed too heavy for the stillness around him. She swallowed hard and stepped closer. "Your Majesty?" The words barely left her mouth. Suddenly, the chamber doors burst open behind her. 3 royal healers entered first, in gray ceremonial robes, followed by the Beta commander himself, tall, scarred, silver threading his dark hair near the temples. Unlike the nobles downstairs, he wore no ceremonial colors for the succession gathering, only black military leather and the royal crest at his shoulder. His eyes moved immediately toward the bed, then toward the shifted hand. He stopped walking, just for a second. One healer scoffed under his breath. "Muscle reflex," the older man muttered while approaching the bed. Nothing more. But his hands shook slightly while checking the king's pulse. Another healer reached to pull back the blanket farther. The moment his fingers brushed the Alpha King's wrist, a low sound rumbled through the room. Deep. Animal. Every candle flickered violently. One went out completely. The healer jerked backward so hard he hit the bedside table. Glass medicine bottles crashed onto the floor. Nobody moved. The growl faded as quickly as it came. Rain battered the windows harder now. Somewhere below, the castle bells began tolling for the arrival ceremony. The Beta commander slowly turned his gaze toward the Omega girl. "You," he said quietly. She looked up. His jaw tightened once before he spoke again. "From now on, nobody enters this chamber unless you are already inside." The northern wing was no longer quiet by evening. Armor clanged through the corridors. Noble voices rose and fell beyond the tower doors. Every servant entering the chamber now glanced behind themselves first, like they expected claws to scrape across the stone at any second. The succession feast downstairs had started an hour ago, but half the castle's attention remained fixed on the unconscious king above them. Fear traveled faster than music. The Omega girl knelt beside the bed, replacing the cold cloth across the Alpha King's forehead, when another disturbance rolled through the hallway outside. Raised voices, boots stopping abruptly, then silence. A guard pushed open the chamber doors. "The regent is coming." Every healer in the room immediately straightened. One servant nearly dropped a silver tray while rushing aside. The girl stood slowly, hands damp from cedar water. The regent entered with 6 royal council members behind him. Gold candlelight reflected across their ceremonial rings and dark velvet coats. They brought the smell of wine, smoke, and politics into the cold chamber. The regent's eyes moved across the room once before settling on the bed. His expression remained calm. Too calm. "Report," he said. One healer stepped forward quickly. "The body shows involuntary response patterns, my lord, but no meaningful consciousness." The words came too fast. Sweat glistened near the man's temple despite the cold room. Another low rumble suddenly vibrated through the chamber, soft, but deep enough to shake the water inside the medicine bowls. Several council members stiffened immediately. One older noble took a full step backward before catching himself. The sound had come from the bed. Silence followed. The Alpha King remained motionless beneath the blankets. The regent approached slowly. Candlelight shifted across his face as he stopped beside the mattress. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then his hand moved toward the king's wrist. The pause before contact was brief, almost invisible, but it existed. His fingers hovered there half a second too long. The room noticed. So did the Beta commander standing near the windows. The moment the regent touched the Alpha King's skin, every candle nearest the bed flickered violently. One burst out entirely. A servant gasped. Another dropped her gaze straight to the floor. The regent removed his hand immediately, not abruptly, but faster than before. His jaw tightened once. "Enough." The single word cut through the chamber sharply. "The succession proceeds tomorrow as planned." No one answered right away. Rain battered the windows harder outside. Somewhere below, distant laughter from the feast echoed faintly upward before dying beneath another crack of thunder. The regent turned toward the Omega girl suddenly. "You." Her breath caught. "How often does this happen?" Several heads snapped toward her at once. She lowered her eyes carefully. "More often these past few nights, my lord." "And why," one council member interrupted coldly, "were we not informed immediately?" The accusation hit the room like a slap. The girl opened her mouth, but another voice answered first. "Because panic spreads faster than facts." The Beta commander stepped forward at last. Calm, controlled, yet his eyes never left the bed. One councilman frowned. "You believe this means something?" The commander stayed silent for a moment too long before replying. "I believe the king is reacting." A murmur spread instantly among the nobles, sharp whispers, uneasy shifting. One noblewoman clutched the silver wolf pendant at her throat so tightly her knuckles whitened. The regent's gaze moved toward the commander, still calm, still unreadable, yet the silence between them stretched, heavy. Then the bed creaked softly. Every head turned. The Alpha King's hand had tightened around the blanket, not fully, but enough to pull the dark fabric several inches downward across his chest. One council member stumbled backward into a table. Glass rattled violently. The Omega girl instinctively stepped closer to the bed. The movement was small, natural, protective. The regent noticed immediately. His eyes flicked toward her hand resting near the king's arm. Another pause followed, this one longer. Then he spoke without looking away from her. "Double the guards outside this chamber tonight." His voice remained steady, and the girl stays. Snow began falling before dawn, soft enough to quiet the entire castle. For the first time in days, the northern wing felt almost calm. No shouting in the halls, no frightened servants rushing downstairs. Even the guards outside the chamber doors spoke in lower voices now, their armor no longer clanging every few minutes with nervous movement. The succession ceremony had been delayed until further notice. Officially, the regent blamed the storm. Unofficially, nobody believed that anymore. The Omega girl knelt beside the fireplace, feeding another cedar branch into the flames when she heard the sound behind her. Breathing, different this time, not rough, not uneven, steady. she turned slowly toward the bed. The Alpha King's chest rose beneath the dark blankets in deep, controlled rhythm, almost like natural sleep instead of unconsciousness. Warm color had returned faintly to his face overnight. The sharp grayness that haunted his skin for years was fading little by little. She stood carefully and crossed the room with fresh bandages folded in her hands. Morning light slipped through the tall windows, pale against the snow outside. It touched the side of his face as she leaned near him. Even now he looked impossibly dangerous resting there, like something powerful pretending to sleep. Her fingers paused briefly above his wrist before replacing the bandage near an old scar. The moment her skin brushed his breathing slowed again. Tiny reaction, but immediate. She looked down at their hands. His remained still beneath hers, large and cold against the white linen sheets. Yet the tension in his arm eased, little by little, under her touch. Outside the chamber, boots passed by the doors, then faded away again. No interruptions, no panic. The silence almost felt safe, a dangerous feeling. She dipped the cloth into warm cedar water and gently wiped a faint streak of dried medicine from his neck. They postponed the ceremony, she murmured softly without thinking. The castle feels different today. No answer came, only the fire crackling quietly nearby. Still, she stayed close while replacing the blankets around his shoulders. Her movements had become instinct after 3 years, careful around old injuries, slower near the ribs where his breathing sometimes tightened. One candle beside the bed flickered suddenly, then steadied again. The girl glanced toward it. Nothing else moved. Behind her, the chamber doors opened softly. The Beta commander entered, alone this time. Snow dusted the shoulders of his dark coat. He stopped after 2 steps, eyes immediately scanning the room before landing on the king. "Any change?" he asked quietly. The girl hesitated. "He seems calmer." The commander gave a faint nod, but did not approach the bed right away. Instead, his attention drifted toward the untouched breakfast tray near the wall, then toward the windows, then back to the king again. Restless, like a man waiting for a battlefield to move beneath his feet. "The regent doubled security downstairs," he said after a moment. "Nobody enters this floor without permission now." The girl lowered her eyes slightly. "Because they're afraid?" The commander's expression barely shifted. "Because the kingdom notices weakness faster than loyalty." Silence settled again. He finally stepped closer to the bed. For several seconds, he simply stared at the Alpha King's face. Then his gaze lowered toward the girl's hand resting lightly near the king's arm. Another pause, smaller this time. "He only settles when you're here," the commander said quietly. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cloth. Before she could answer, a loud crash echoed somewhere below the tower. Both of them flinched instinctively. Voices erupted faintly from the lower corridor. Running footsteps followed. The commander turned sharply toward the doors, hand already near the sword at his side. The interruption lasted only seconds before fading again into muffled confusion downstairs. But when the room fell quiet once more, something had changed. The Alpha King's hand was no longer lying beside him. It had shifted upward across the blanket. Slowly, deliberately. His fingers were curled tightly around the edge of the Omega girl's sleeve. The commander stopped breathing for a moment. Neither of them moved. Then, without opening his eyes, the Alpha King tightened his grip. The moment the Alpha King's hand closed around her sleeve, the room changed. Not loudly, not violently, but the air itself tightened. The Beta commander stared at the king's grip without blinking, while snow drifted quietly beyond the windows behind him. The Omega girl remained frozen beside the bed, afraid even the smallest movement might break whatever fragile thread had formed between them. The king's fingers stayed locked around the fabric near her wrist. Firm, intentional, alive. Then footsteps thundered toward the chamber, multiple guards this time. The doors burst open hard enough to shake the candle flames. "Commander, one soldier breathed, slightly out of breath. "The council is demanding answers downstairs." The guard stopped speaking the instant he noticed the king's hand. His face drained of color almost immediately. Behind him, another soldier leaned sideways for a better look and visibly recoiled. Word spread before anyone could stop it. Within minutes, whispers flooded the northern hall again. Servants gathered near the stairwell pretending to carry linens while straining to hear through the doors. Guards exchanged tense glances. Somewhere below, music from the delayed succession feast stopped entirely. The castle had begun holding its breath. Inside the chamber, the regent arrived faster than expected. He entered without ceremony this time, dark coat still dusted with snow from outside. Several council members followed close behind him, speaking over one another until the sight near the bed silenced them instantly. The Alpha King still held the Omega girl's sleeve. Nobody moved. One older noble let out a quiet curse beneath his breath. Another took 2 slow steps backward toward the door. The regent approached carefully, too carefully. His eyes dropped first to the king's hand, then to the girl, then back again. "Remove her," one councilman said suddenly. "This is manipulation." "He's unconscious," another snapped nervously. "It's reflex." Yet neither man stepped closer to test that theory themselves. The regent remained silent for several seconds. That silence unsettled the room more than shouting would have. Finally, he spoke. "Release the girl." Calm voice, controlled, directed at the bed itself. Nothing happened. The king's grip tightened slightly instead. A faint crease appeared between the regent's brows before vanishing again. Tiny crack, gone almost instantly. "Your Majesty," he tried again, slower this time. The chamber lights flickered. Not 1 or 2 candles, all of them. Every flame bent sharply toward the bed as a low rumble rolled through the mattress beneath the king. Several servants outside screamed softly and scattered from the doorway. One council member stumbled into a chair hard enough to knock it over. The Beta commander stepped forward immediately, placing himself halfway between the bed and the others without seeming to realize he had done it. Protective, instinctive. The Omega girl felt the king's fingers shift again against her sleeve. Higher now, closer to her wrist. Warmth had returned to his hand completely. That frightened her most. "This cannot continue," a councilman barked, voice shaking despite the anger. "The kingdom already believes he's waking." "Maybe he is," the commander answered flatly. Silence hit hard. Even the regent turned toward him. The commander did not lower his eyes. Another crack in the room. Smaller this time. More dangerous. Outside the chamber, raised voices suddenly erupted from downstairs. Then, the sharp sound of metal striking stone. A servant came running into the hall beyond the doors. "They're fighting in the lower court," someone shouted breathlessly. "The Eastern nobles are refusing the succession vote." The castle had started splitting apart. The regent's jaw tightened visibly now. For the first time since entering, he looked tired, truly tired. His gaze shifted back toward the king's hand gripping the girl's sleeve. Long pause, then came the decision. "Take the girl downstairs," he ordered quietly. The room stiffened. "Question her privately until this situation stabilizes." The Omega girl looked up immediately. 2 guards stepped toward the bed. The instant one reached for her arm, the Alpha King growled. Deep. Raw. Not from sleep anymore. The sound shook through the chamber walls like distant thunder. Every guard stopped moving. One actually stepped back. The growl faded slowly, but the warning remained hanging in the air. The Beta commander's hand settled on the hilt of his sword. This time, he did not hide it. By nightfall, the entire palace had turned restless. Corridors that once echoed with music and ceremonial chatter now carried only hurried footsteps and low arguments behind half-closed doors. Servants stopped speaking whenever guards passed. Noble families gathered in tight circles beneath chandeliers downstairs, whispering through pale faces while snowstorms battered the castle walls outside. Every few minutes, another rumor climbed the tower. The king spoke. The king attacked someone. The king stood beside the bed. None of it was true. Yet nobody slept. Inside the northern chamber, tension pressed against the walls hard enough to feel physical. The Omega Girl remained seated beside the bed, while royal healers moved cautiously around the room, replacing candles and checking medicine supplies with shaking hands. Nobody came too close to the mattress anymore, not after the growl. The Alpha King still held part of her sleeve loosely in his hand. Even unconscious, he refused to let go completely. One healer noticed it and quietly crossed himself before turning away. Another refused to approach the left side of the bed at all. Near midnight, a sudden roar of voices erupted from the lower courtyard, loud enough to shake dust from the ceiling beams. The guards outside immediately rushed toward the windows overlooking the castle gates. "What now?" one muttered under his breath. The Beta commander stepped into the hall moments later, returning from downstairs with snow melting across his boots and tension carved deep into his face. "The Western clans arrived," he said shortly to the guards. "Half of them are refusing to swear loyalty to the regent." More shouting rose from below. Metal gates groaned open somewhere in the storm. A horse screamed sharply in the courtyard before the sound vanished beneath the wind. The commander entered the chamber without waiting for announcement this time. His eyes immediately searched for the girl first, then the king. Small shift, but noticeable. "You should rest," he told her quietly. She shook her head before he even finished speaking. The commander looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, his gaze drifted toward the king's hand gripping her sleeve. His shoulders lowered slightly. Not surrender, acceptance. "Fine," he muttered. Another interruption hit before silence could settle again. One of the younger guards stumbled through the chamber doors, breathing hard. "Commander," he said quickly, "the council is demanding the girl be removed from the tower immediately." The Omega Girl stiffened. The commander did not answer right away. Outside the windows, lightning flashed white across the snow. For one brief second, the Alpha King's face illuminated sharply against the dark room. Alive, not corpse-like anymore. Alive enough to unsettle everyone looking at him. "Tell them no," the commander said flatly. The young guard blinked in surprise. "Sir? You heard me." Defiant now, clear enough that even the servants nearby exchanged startled glances. Before the guard could respond, the chamber suddenly went freezing cold. Every candle flame shrank low at once. The room fell silent so quickly it hurt. Then came the sound. Breathing. Heavy. Controlled. Different. The Omega Girl turned slowly toward the bed. The Alpha King's chest rose sharply beneath the blankets. Once. Twice. His fingers tightened around her sleeve, hard enough to wrinkle the fabric completely. One healer backed straight into the wall. Another dropped a silver medicine cup that rolled loudly across the floor before spinning to a stop beneath the bed. Nobody dared retrieve it. The king's head shifted slightly against the pillow. Tiny movement, but enough to send panic through the room. Guards outside immediately crowded near the doorway, trying to look inside. Whispers exploded down the corridor. "He moved again. I saw it. His eyes opened earlier. Get the regent!" Footsteps thundered away through the halls. The entire northern wing spiraled into chaos within seconds. Yet in the center of it, the Omega Girl leaned closer, carefully, her free hand hovering near the king's shoulder. "It's all right," she whispered softly. The Alpha King's breathing eased almost immediately beneath her voice. Around them, people noticed. One servant covered her mouth in shock. The commander stared openly now, no longer hiding it. Outside the chamber, dozens of frightened voices filled the corridor. Then all at once, they stopped. Absolute silence crashed over the hall beyond the doors. Someone had arrived. Heavy footsteps approached slowly through the crowd outside. Nobody spoke as the regent entered the doorway. Snow clung to his dark coat. His silver eyes lifted toward the bed, then froze. The Alpha King was staring back at him. No one in the chamber breathed after that. The Alpha King's eyes remained fixed on the regent from across the room, bright gold beneath the dim candlelight, steady enough to make the entire northern wing feel smaller around him. Outside the doors, the crowd of guards and servants fell backward in a ripple of panic. Someone whispered, "He's awake." Another voice immediately answered, trembling, "Get on your knees." The word spread through the corridor faster than fire. Inside the chamber, the regent did not move at first. Snow melted slowly from the shoulders of his black coat onto the stone floor, while the king continued staring at him without blinking. The silence stretched so long it became unbearable. Then the Alpha King's gaze shifted, slowly, deliberately, away from the regent, toward the Omega girl beside him. The pressure in the room changed instantly, softer, stranger. His hand still held her sleeve, the same sleeve he had refused to release all night, the same hand servants once called lifeless. The girl's breathing caught when his fingers loosened slightly against the fabric, not releasing her, just adjusting closer, as though recognizing warmth after endless winter. One of the healers collapsed into a chair behind them with a weak sound under his breath. Another covered his mouth with trembling fingers. The Beta commander stood perfectly still near the windows, but his eyes had lowered now. Respect. Instinctive. Old. The Alpha King finally moved again. A shallow inhale lifted his chest. Then another. Muscles in his shoulders tightened beneath the blankets as he pushed himself upward, slowly. The entire chamber reacted at once. Several guards outside stumbled backward. A servant dropped a lantern in the hall with a loud crack that sent sparks skidding across the stone before someone kicked it aside. Nobody looked away from the bed long enough to care. The king sat up halfway, weak, pale, but terrifying anyway. The old claw scar near his collarbone caught the candlelight as the blankets slipped lower. 3 years asleep, and the room still bent around him like prey sensing a predator stand. The regent stepped forward at last. "Your Majesty," he said carefully. Calm voice, careful voice, too careful. The Alpha King ignored him completely. Instead, his eyes remained on the Omega girl, on the bruised wrist partially hidden beneath her sleeve, on the damp cedar cloth still clenched loosely in her other hand. Callback after callback without a word spoken. The baths, the nights, the waiting. The girl swallowed hard as he slowly lifted one shaking hand toward her face. Several people in the chamber visibly tensed. One guard even reached instinctively for his weapon before stopping himself. The king's fingertips brushed softly against her jaw. Warm now, alive now. The room nearly shattered from the weight of that single touch. The Alpha King's voice came rough when he finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "You stayed." A servant near the doorway burst into tears immediately. Another dropped straight to their knees. Then came the chain reaction. One noble bowed his head first, then another. Armor struck stone throughout the corridor outside as guards knelt almost simultaneously. The sound rolled through the northern wing like thunder, knees hitting marble, weapons lowering, heads bowing. The kingdom correcting itself in real time. The regent remained standing alone, for one dangerous second too long. The Beta commander looked toward him quietly, waiting. Everyone was waiting. Snow hissed softly against the windows. Candle flames flickered low. The Alpha King finally lifted his eyes toward the regent again. Nothing dramatic, no threat spoken aloud, just one look. The regent's jaw tightened once. Tiny crack. Final crack. Then slowly, with every noble and servant watching, he lowered himself to one knee beside the bed. The chamber exhaled all at once, some in relief, some in fear. The Alpha King barely seemed to notice anymore. His attention had already returned to the Omega girl. His thumb brushed lightly across the edge of her sleeve where his fingers had clung through the night. The torn fabric remained wrinkled beneath his hand. Proof. Quiet proof. Outside the tower, the palace bells suddenly began ringing on their own through the snowstorm. Loud, deep, endless. And for the first time in 3 years, the entire kingdom heard them as the bells of a living king. Morning arrived slowly over the palace, pale sunlight spreading across snow-covered towers that no longer flew mourning banners. During the night, servants had climbed ladders through the freezing wind to tear down every strip of black cloth hanging from the castle walls. Gold wolf crests stood visible again above the gates by dawn. The kingdom had changed before sunrise finished touching the mountains, and everyone inside the palace moved differently because of it. Heads lowered faster now when the Omega girl walked through the corridors. Conversations stopped the moment she appeared. Servants who once shoved past her against narrow stairwells immediately stepped aside instead, clutching trays tightly against their chests while avoiding direct eye contact. One older maid even bowed so quickly she nearly dropped an armful of fresh linens. The girl paused at first, startled by it. The maid only lowered her head further. "Forgive me," she whispered automatically. No one had ever apologized to her in this castle before. Outside the northern chamber, royal guards stood in 2 silent rows beneath silver banners. The same guards who once mocked tower duty now straightened the instant she approached. One pushed open the heavy doors before she could reach them. Another lowered his gaze respectfully. Inside, warmth filled the chamber for the first time in years. The fires burned high. Sunlight crossed the marble floor instead of candle shadows. The air no longer smelled like sickness and stale medicine alone. It smelled alive. The Alpha King sat near the tall windows, wrapped in a dark wool coat, his silver-black hair falling loose around his shoulders, while snow drifted softly beyond the glass behind him. He still carried traces of weakness, small ones. The slight pause before standing fully straight, the careful way one hand rested briefly against the arm of the chair after long silence. But nobody mistook those moments for fragility anymore. Power lingered around him too heavily now. Several royal advisors stood near the doors, speaking in cautious voices, until the king lifted one hand slightly. The entire room fell silent immediately. Then his eyes moved toward the Omega girl, entering the chamber. Everything softened again, not dramatically, just enough to change the atmosphere around him. The advisors noticed. So did the guards. One by one, they quietly stepped farther back, leaving space around her without being told. Social shift complete, irreversible. The girl approached with fresh bandages and cedar water balanced carefully in her hands, the same way she had done hundreds of times before. Only now, nobody treated her presence beside the king as strange. It had become the center of the room itself. The Alpha King watched her quietly while she replaced the wrapping around his wrist. Her fingers remained steady despite the weight of attention surrounding them. Outside the chamber doors, servants passed more slowly than necessary, just to glimpse inside. Whispers drifted faintly through the corridor. That's her, the one who stayed. The king wouldn't wake for anyone else. Inside, the king's gaze lowered briefly toward the faded bruise still visible near her wrist. The same bruise he had noticed the night he woke. His jaw tightened, almost invisibly. One advisor near the doorway immediately straightened nervously, sensing the shift without understanding it. The Alpha King reached for the cloth in her hands before she could pull away. Their fingers brushed lightly together. Warmth. Familiar now. No more tower duty, one nobleman suddenly offered, too quickly from near the wall, eager to please. We can assign her proper royal quarters at once. The king looked toward him slowly enough to make the entire room tense again. She goes where she chooses, he said calmly. The nobleman lowered his head immediately. Of course, Your Majesty. Silence settled afterward. Comfortable this time, the Omega girl turned slightly toward the windows to place the fresh cedar bowl beside the fire. Below the tower, the castle courtyard had filled with kneeling soldiers and arriving clan leaders, waiting for royal audience beneath falling snow. Thousands of eyes lifted toward the northern tower now, instead of away from it. The king rose carefully from his chair. The room instinctively stepped back to make space for him, but when he moved, he stopped beside her first, always beside her. His hand settled lightly against the small of her back as they faced the windows together. Below them, the entire palace bowed, and this time, Nobody needed to be told why.